Mitch Albom, welcome to Conversations.
Thank
Good
you.
to have you here.
My pleasure.
Welcome
Thank
to
you.
Seattle. I know you've been through here a few times. Now, what is it about you and older Jewish men who seem to come into your life and really, well, they give you something pretty special?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's happened 30 times.
Yeah.
It happened, obviously, first time with Maury Schwartz, who was my college professor from Brandeis University, who was dying from Lou Gehrig's disease. And that was quite an accident. I mean, I just went to visit him once out of guilt because I had lost touch with him. And then he sort of guilted me into another visit and another visit and another visit. And along the way, I found out that he couldn't pay his medical bills. And so I thought, well, how can I help him? And I wrote a little book. It was the only way I could think of to raise money, and gave him the money that we got for the book. He passed away from ALS. I wrote the little book. It was supposed to be a tiny, nothing, 20,000 copy book. And it turned into Tuesdays with Maury, and it's, you know, I don't know how many millions of copies. So,
And a movie.
and yeah. So,
And a documentary and much, much more.
yeah. So that kind of, I mean, that was one phenomenon. And then this new book, Have a Little Faith, which just came out, that started quite differently. I mean, that was a person who I'd known for a long time, a rabbi where I'd grown up in New Jersey from my small little town there, who on a visit back home, just out of the blue, pulled me aside. He was 82 years old. He was using a cane at this point, whatever, pulled me aside and said, "I'd like you to do the eulogy at my funeral." And this just totally threw me because, first of all, I wasn't that religious. I hadn't lived in the town for 20 some odd years. I came back once a year for the big, you know, high holiday services.
This is in New Jersey, right?
In New Jersey. Yeah. And here was the man who does eulogies asking me to do his eulogy.
And this was Rabbi
Albert Lewis. I thought these people had this all worked out with one another, you know, like rabbis and priests. If I go first, you do mine. If you go first, you cover me.
Yeah.
So asking somebody like me, a layperson, to do it not only was stunning, but I felt terribly ill-prepared. And so I said, well, the only way I could do this is if I get to know you as a human being. I mean, I've never eaten with you. I've never been to your home. I've never driven in a car with you. And he said, okay, come on. I thought it would be a few meetings because, let's face it, when somebody asks you to do a eulogy, you generally feel the end may be near. Right. 8 years later, I was still visiting. He survived a stroke and a heart attack and a cancer scare and all kinds of things. But during those 8 years, I had such an amazing education about faith, about men of faith, about the presumptions that I had had about faith and sort of the, I think, prejudices and just sort of cynicism that I had. And by the time those years were over and I had gotten involved with a pastor in Detroit as well, I had a whole different attitude about it, and that ultimately led to the book.
One thing that you do in this book is that you kind of juxtapose both of them
Right.
and their lives, and you do it very well. I mean, it's very readable and very enjoyable, but I think the other thing is that you find these things about them and their personalities, two different worlds that really pop out. Albert Lewis, tell me about his character, because he is a character.
Right, and the two men that you refer to, one is Albert Lewis, the rabbi, 82 years old and dying. The other is Henry Covington, a pastor in Detroit, the polar opposite. Not just because he's Christian, not just because he's African American, not just because he labors in a church with a giant hole in its roof that's so poor that they turn the heat off and homeless people are literally sleeping on the floor shivering under blankets, but because he was a criminal and you know, led a real tough life and had to sort of have that revelation moment, I'm going to give my life over to Jesus, and turn his life around. Whereas a rabbi had led this exemplary life from day one, had been a pillar of the community, and all the rest of it. He was, as you point out, a very funny, almost eccentric to some degree, kind of iconoclastic clergyman. He would, for example, sing everything, every sentence that he could think of, he would sing. So if I would say to him, "So how you feeling?" he'd say, "The old gray rabbi ain't what he used to be, ain't what," and he would just keep singing. You know, it's one thing to sing a half a line, it's to sing 2 verses, and you're sitting there with a smile on your face going, "Please stop singing." But he was unembarrassable. You know, he loved a corny joke. He even had a sign on his office door that I guess somebody he had seen once. He said that was so funny about a parking space. It said, "You take in my space, I break in your face," you know, which isn't something that you would think a rabbi would put in his door. He used to do his sermons with clips from Time Magazine and Saturday Evening Post. He used to pull out a Peanuts cartoon and said, let me tell you what Charlie Brown said. And he'd always be able to draw a lesson out of this. I remember one time he came with a squash in one hand and a big piece of wood in another hand. And he put them down and he had a hammer. And he smashed the squash, which burst apart. And then he banged the hammer on the wood and banged it, and it made no dent at all. And the point that he was trying to make, which he did, was that things that grow fast and are flashy and quick and colorful and bright often are more easily destroyed than that which takes a long, slow time to develop, like wood or tradition, which he also sang, you know, tradition, like that. And so you enjoyed, I mean, there are a lot of places where if a rabbi or a priest does a sermon, that's when everybody heads for the exits because they go, oh, he's going to go on and on and on. This was the polar opposite where I grew up. People of his congregation flocked in and they looked at their watch. Oh, we don't want to miss it. We don't want to miss it. Now, they flocked out as soon as he finished, much to his chagrin. But he was that kind of embracing figure. He drew people to him. He was very magnetic.
And as much as he valued tradition, he really did value tradition.
Yeah.
But he had that other side of him that made it palatable for people to come to temple and to listen to him.
He wasn't judgmental. He you know, I, for example, was raised Jewish, but I married a Christian, a very devout Christian woman, and he knows her, knew her, and loved her. And, you know, I used to say, well, how come you're not mad at me? And he said, well, what would being mad at you do? I said, but how do you justify that with your faith? He said, well, okay, let's be honest. If you came to me, as he would sing, if you came to me and you said, guess what, she wants to convert, I wouldn't be unhappy, you know, but until that day, we'll all get along. And that desire and willingness to accept people who they were was a fundamental underpinning of the book, that faith can be something that you can respect in other people, even if you embrace your own. When he arrived in the little town where we grew up, it was the only synagogue within 20 miles. It was surrounded by 8 churches in a single borough, including 2, one on this street and one on this street. It was literally the middle of the Oreo. It was the sandwich, a church here and a church there. And he had to deal with people literally knowing so little about people of his faith that he would go to a public school to try to explain to kids, okay, I'm a rabbi, this is what a rabbi does. And in the middle of one of those sessions with 3rd graders, a kid raised his hand and said, where are your horns? He said, I'm sorry? He said, where are your horns? My dad said all Jews have horns. And he, instead of getting angry, he invited the little boy to come up. He said, come up here. And he leaned his head down. He said, go ahead, see if I have any horns. And he let him rub his, imagine this, a grown man letting a child run his hand through his hair. And he said, do you see any horns? He said, no. He said, okay, sit back down. Now, where was I? You know, to have that kind of patience and understanding of other people's, even their shortcomings, was very inspiring. And it became a big underpinning of what I wanted to say in the book, which is we need to have respect for everybody's faith, no matter what it is.
And actually, then you have on the other end of the spectrum, Henry Covington, who, as you mentioned, comes from a very hard background. He'd been a criminal. He'd spent time in prison. You know, he knew that hard side of life, and then he's at this church in Detroit that doesn't have anything.
Right.
And he's a different kind of way of building faith.
Much different. He had taken a turn. I mean, he had been a drug dealer that was once, you know, earning $500,000 in just over a year. You know, anything he wanted, he would tell, I want a TV set, go get me a TV set, I'll give you some drugs. He didn't even have to leave his chair, and he could furnish his apartment. And then he tried some of his own product, as often happens, and next thing you know, he's an addict, and next thing you know, he's robbing everybody he can. And finally, in one night of desperation, when he's 30 years old, he robs his own drug dealers, which is never a good idea, and then realizes when he's at home getting high on all their product and counting their money that they know where he lives. And so he races out front with a shotgun, and he's hiding behind a row of trash cans with a shotgun in the middle of the night, his wife and child in the house, and he does that thing that we all do when we're in trouble, you know, get me out of this. And he says, Jesus, if you give me tonight, I'll give you the rest of my days. Just get me through the night. Just don't let me be killed. Don't have them kill my family, and you can have me. And he survived the night. And when he woke up in the morning, you know, the sun came out, and he crawled into bed next to his wife who'd been crying all night, and he tapped her on the shoulder. He said, I want to ask you something. What's keeping you from going to God? And she said, "You are." And he stumbled into the bathroom and dropped to his knees, began to pray. And he guzzled a bottle of NyQuil, knocked himself out for a day. Another bottle of NyQuil, knocked himself out for another day. Another bottle of NyQuil, the poor man's drug habit fix. And when he finally came through, he was broken of his addiction, and he began his slow, gradual climb back to keep his promise. And 20 years later was when I encountered him as a pastor of a church in Detroit that was so poor that literally they had shut the power off numerous times, and the electricity and the gas in the middle of winter, so that on the nights when homeless people slept there, they literally would have to turn on these blowers to try to blow hot air just to get the temperature from 8 degrees to 25 degrees. And that the congregation literally, and I know this sounds like he must be exaggerating this, but I promise you, I'm telling you, I saw this with my own eyes week after week, had to build a plastic tent, plasticine plastic, hammered into 2x4s inside their sanctuary, because the sanctuary had a giant hole in the roof. All the air went up into it, any heat or anything, so they couldn't run heat, and they had their power shut off. Snow and rain came in through this so that you could see piles of snow inside the sanctuary. All the pews were covered with buckets and trays, and they built a plastic tent, about 25 feet wide and about 10 feet high, and they huddled inside this plastic tent on Sunday mornings, wearing overcoats and praying on Sunday morning inside a plastic tent in the 21st century in the richest country in the world. There's something the matter with that. And I felt compelled to write about not only that terrible, impoverished situation that we have in Detroit, but the faith that it would take to come in an overcoat in a plastic tent. You've got that little, and still believe that things were going to get better, and still say hallelujah when the pastor said, Jesus will watch out for us. And I found in that unshakable faith a parallel with what I found in the rabbi all the way 600 miles away as he was about to die. Unshakable faith that he had been right in his life, and that what was going to happen for a reason. And I just thought, wow, if you can find a thread that connects these two guys, it must be a thread that goes through all of us.
When you first met Henry Covington, you didn't trust him.
No.
Because of his background.
Well, let me put it to you this way, Enrique. When within 5 minutes of meeting a pastor who weighs 400 pounds, is wearing a white T-shirt, sweating from his forehead, mopping his brow, says, "Come on, sit down." And within 5 minutes, he's saying, "Well, yeah, I was in prison for manslaughter, and I was a drug dealer, and I was a drug addict, and I was that." On the one hand, you say it's nice that he's being honest. On the other hand, you say, isn't there at some point you get disqualified from the pulpit? Like there's a minimum test score you have to achieve, and you can get. Plus, if I'm being totally honest, it wasn't my world when I first got there. I mean, I had seen the black church from afar. You live in Detroit, you're going to, but I had never really been actively involved in it or attended a lot of services.
How did you end up finding him or finding this?
He ran this homeless program, and I am actively involved with the homeless in Detroit. I had started a charity that funded various homeless shelters, and I literally went on an inspection. I was going to see if his place was worthy of giving some of the money that we raised.
And that's the Hole in the Roof Foundation?
Well, actually, it's called Say Detroit. The Hole in the Roof Foundation is something new that we've created, a new charity to try to fix places like Henry's Church, which have, places of faith that take care of the homeless, but have holes or broken windows or busted pipes.
So you went to go see whether or really
not,
somebody to
yeah.
invest
So
in?
I am in the position of trying to judge him. Is he trustworthy to begin with? And he's telling me all these things, and I'm thinking, And then I go to some of the services. Now I'm used to the traditional, you sit in the congregation, the clergyman comes up, he does his sermon, you listen, you nod, good sermon, Well, Henry's Church is, anybody who's got something to say, you just come up and say it. If it's right in the middle of the service, whether it's, preach it or amen or hallelujah, or there's one guy named Virgil who literally just stands up whenever he feels like it and goes, "Well," like that. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with the service. You know, the pastor can be saying, well, we'll turn to page 23. Well, thank you, Virgil. Okay. And anyhow, here's a prayer that, well, you know, whenever the Spirit moves them. And it's just noise and kids crying and all kinds of energy. And so it was new to me. And this is what I try to point out my own flaws in all the books I write, especially if they're true stories, because I think if you're not honest about yourself, then you can't expect the readers to think that you're being honest about anything else. So I admit that, you know, I was kind of uncomfortable with all that, and it's not mine. But that's what we always do with faith. The first thing we say is, it's not mine. So it must be different, and therefore I shouldn't trust it, or there must be something wrong, or they must be the enemy. And what I came to learn, and what I'm trying to encourage, is you can say it's not mine, but you can still say, but here's what's the same as mine. And the more I went, the more Henry would use in his sermons. He said, well, let's turn to the book of Saul. You know, and I'm thinking, Saul? Well, I remember that from, it must be another Saul. It must be a Saul from the New Testament. You know, no, it's Saul from the Old Testament. And you realize, well, there's many connections.
There's a connection.
Of course, especially
faiths.
between Christianity and
Right.
Judaism.
Yeah.
And over time, I got to see Henry in a very different light. I remember one night during this time where it was freezing cold and there were about 80 homeless men sleeping on the floor. I forgot something and I had to go back. And I ran up to the office, and when I came down, he didn't know I was there. And I came around the corner and I saw him. He's a very large man, and you can't mistake him. And I saw him sitting all by himself on a balcony overlooking the floor where these 80 men were sleeping, just as a sentinel, you know, just making sure that nothing happened. I mean, just sitting in the dark, watching him, making sure if somebody would get up or cause trouble, he'd have to. And I said, you know, no one's chronicling this. He doesn't know that I'm seeing this. That's faith. You know, that little act of, I'm here to take care of my brother's keeper. I am my brother's keeper. Those little moments started to break down my distrust, and I saw many, many examples of them. And eventually, I came to say, you know, the problem's me. The problem's not him. The problem is me.
Well, let's go back to, what did you call him, the Reb?
The Reb, yeah.
Your rabbi.
As kids, I don't know, he was like a superhero. I mean, he was a big guy to begin with. He was like 6'1", 6'2", and he had big shock of hair and glasses, and, you know, he just scared the bejeebers out of me, and I would always run the opposite direction whenever I saw him. I said, he knows something. He knows something. I must have done something. Even if I didn't do anything, I must have done something. He's going to point it out. And so we called him the Reb. It was like the Hulk or the Silver Surfer or the Thing, you know.
So eventually on the 8-year journey with him in this time, you get to know a lot about yourself,
Yeah.
but also get to know a lot about his real personality, all these things.
Right.
But he doesn't die right away.
No.
And then finally, when the time comes, after he battles cancer, he has a stroke. When that time really came, how tough was that? Knowing that you finally were going to be delivering this eulogy,
Well,
what he'd asked you to do.
That's what he asked me to do. You know, it was funny. You brought up at the beginning of our conversation Tuesdays with Maury, and I did find that there were some parallels as he approached the end. The same with Maury. Even though you didn't know it was the end at the time, it was like a light came on, and there was an increased wisdom and generosity of spirit to the things that he would share with me. And one of the last of which was, it might have been the last time I saw him. We were talking about heaven. And I was asking all these questions, and at one point he just, I asked so many questions that he did one of these talk to God things where he sings, and he said, "Please, Lord, this one has so many questions, so give him many more years of life so that when we see each other again, we'll have lots to talk about." And I looked at him and I said, "Do you really think we're going to see each other again?" And he said, "Don't you?" And I said, "Well, let's face it, I don't think I'm going where you're going. You know, I mean, you're on a whole other level." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're a man of God." And he looked at me kind of sadly. He said, "But you're a man of God too. Everyone is." And for him to put himself, this righteous, selfless man of 90 years, on a level with me, who was nowhere near belonging to that level, but to him, we were all children of God. that resonated so largely with me and became such an underpinning of this story, because that's how we should look at everybody. Whether we're not, we may think we're better or more worthy, but we're all children of God. Whatever faith, however you express it, we're all children of God. And if you look at people that way, then you're not going to be so prone to hurt them. And you're not going to be so prone to hate them, because you're going to see what they have in common with you. And you could almost tell like it was the end, because the things he was saying had that kind of gravitas and that kind of just quiet wisdom. And not long after that, he was taken to the supermarket by his nurse, something he loved to do. I mean, he just adored going to the supermarket because he was a depression kid, you know, and the whole idea of just going. And he couldn't get out of the car. He was too tired. And we probably should have known right then that that was pretty much the end. And within a few hours, he was at the hospital. And 2 days later, he got up in the morning, and a nurse came in to give him a bath. And he was singing to her. It was about 6:30 in the morning. And he was singing and laughing. And then his head just slumped over. And that was the end of his music. And I write in the book that I like to think that God was so pleased to hear one of his creatures joyous, you know, joyous enough to sing in a hospital, that he took him mid-song, you know, just to capture that moment.
And very peacefully, too.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself in all this? I mean, obviously, you've had some reawakening. You talk about not being an over-religious guy. I mean,
Yeah.
you kind of moved away from your faith. You'd had an interfaith marriage and all of these things.
Well, I learned that I had been wrong about a lot of things, that I had been cynical about religion and faith because it was easy. And you look at the headlines and the scandals, you know, church scandals and ethnic cleansing and everything that's done wrong in the name of faith and in the name of religion. And I had focused on that, and I think I conveniently focused on it so that I would be justified in not practicing. Because I said, well, see, why do I want to participate in something like that for? And so, you know, I'm really good at that. I think a lot of us are, especially if you're in the media or whatever. You know, you come up with logical reasons to explain your lousy behavior.
And it's our excuses, isn't it?
Yeah, but we don't think of it that way.
Yeah,
We think
right.
of it as intelligent, rational explanation, justification.
Life has changed. We don't have time.
Yeah, and I'm not cynical about faith anymore. I really celebrate it, and I don't just mean my own. I mean everybody's. I couldn't even say, when someone said "God bless you" to me, when they would meet me like at a book signing or something, I always felt uncomfortable. And I was like, "Oh, God bless me." Well, whose God are you talking about? And what if you knew that I wasn't the same religion as you? And now I remember I asked the Reb once. I said, "What do you say when people say God bless you?" He says, "I say God bless you too." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I guess I could do that."
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what's become of Henry Covington?
Henry continues to minister at the I Am My Brother's Keeper Church. Our goal is, before this Christmas is done, or before this Christmas comes, to fix that hole in that roof so that they never have to have another cold Christmas. I established a charity called the Hole in the Roof Foundation, and 1/10 of all the profits of this book and the tithing tradition will go to that, to not only first fix that hole, which is giant, but then any other churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever they may be that care for the homeless will be able to apply. And if they've got a repair that needs to be done, if we've got the money and it's a worthwhile organization, we'll try to give it to them. And Henry is helping to administer that. He has the same congregation, the same group of people. There has been some publicity about the book, as you would imagine, and they've come and taken a lot of pictures. And it's funny to watch a lot of these people who literally are either very impoverished or even homeless, and they go, "Oh, another reporter here, you know, another photographer here, you know, well,
Got
okay."
pretty used to it.
Meanwhile, you know, let's carry the hams down to the kitchen so we can do the homeless night. And life goes on, and we're hoping for better things in Detroit. And hope is faith, in my view. That they're one and the same. In the last line of the book, not to ruin it for anybody, but you know, how do you end a book like this? And the last sentence is, "I'm in love with hope," and I am. I don't find that to be a cynical thought at all. I would rather live in a world where people were like that, and I think in Detroit you almost have to be like that. Believe that tomorrow will be better, and I think Henry does too.
And in these times, I think all of us could use some hope and to have a little faith. All right.
Thank you.
Mitch Albom, thank you very much.
Been
Great
my
talking
pleasure.
to you.
I
Great
enjoyed it.
story and seller.
Thank you.
All right.
Nice to
meet
see you,
sir.
Enrique. Thank
All right.
you.
Local production and broadcast of Conversations at KCTS 9 is made possible in part by KCTS 9 members and by a major grant from the Floyd and Dolores Jones Foundation and by viewers like you. Thank you.